So, who decides what counts as normal? How does somebody possibly get to make that decision? And why are we talking about this today? So here's what we want students to take away from a conversation, like the conversation around what constitutes normal. This is a phrase you hear all the time, right? That's normal. That's not normal. And we take normal for granted. But what we want here, we want people to understand that what people consider to be normal changes across place, changes across time, and it changes across social groupings. And this is a particularly powerful lesson because the special thing about the idea of normal is that it convinces us, or people who use it convince us, that the opposite is true. That people think things that are normal have long histories, right? It's just how things have always been done. That has large-scale adoption. It's just what everybody does. Or my favorite, it's what's natural. And in fact, as they use normal to mean that, people often use it just to mean good. Or that's not normal. That's normal. You don't want to be too normal, potentially, but people usually mean, oh, that's not normal, is rarely a compliment, right? Now, this ties into power. So students should understand that people who hold power benefit from others thinking that powerful is normal. And it's couched in the same ways that we justify what's normal. Oh, that power is the way things have always been. That power is, it's what everyone believes. Or it's what happens everywhere. Or it's natural. This is just biology. This is the way men and women evolved. We can't change that. And by being seeming natural and sustaining power, the notion of what's normal helps to sustain sexist and racist hierarchies. And so that's what we want students to take away. And that's why this is quite important stuff. Now, how's it going to work for you? I find the idea of normal to work across what I teach. I teach history, and I'm a white guy teaching history, so I present this in a different way than other teachers might. What's key here is to present it in a way that's going to work for your subject, your class, and the message that you want to get across. So what I'm going to be talking today will be a little bit related to how I would use it in a history class. I'm going to kind of let you see some of my thinking on the screen as regards what I think would work in a history class, but there are definitely ways that this could work more broadly, because what a society considers normal, this is about human relationships with each other and with their environment. And if you think about it, human relationships with each other and with their environment underlie pretty much the basis of every subject. We may have different languages for getting at that relationship. We may get at it visually if we're teaching art. We might get at it through numbers if we're teaching math. We might get at it through what used to be called natural history, but what would today be considered the scientific method, experimentation, if we're getting at it through a science class, right? We might get at it in literally a different literary spoken vernacular language if we're teaching languages. Might get it through music. But ultimately, throughout school, we are devoted to discovering how humans relate to each other and to their environments. And so this should work quite well across subjects. So here's some examples, right? This can help students dig deeper into any subject, and students tend to respond. Here are some possible examples, right? So scientists, if you're teaching a science class, scientists have been pretty heavily involved in creating ideas of what's biologically normal, right? Especially in terms of health. And at the same time, you can get into genre questions. So the scientific mode of writing, why are lab reports so often written in the passive voice? This was observed, right? This happened. It helps convey the idea that these declarations of what's normal actually come from higher authority than human beings, fallible human beings doing their best. Right? And there's important reasons for this, helping to build trust and credibility in the scientific method, trying to get past the idea that fallible humans are behind what's happening. But there's room to play there. There's room to remind us of the human element in science, and that can be a very, very, very important thing to do. Math. The term normal has roots in geometry. It shows up in statistics, right? The normal distribution. Why is it useful there? Why do we use the word normal, and how does the language we use in math, I'm going to talk about this a little more later, but how does the language we use in math show up in society? And people are always trying to know what is relevant. Why is math relevant? This is a lot of math teachers I know tell me this is the number one issue they come up against. When am I ever going to use this? Well, people use this stuff. People use it all the time. They don't even know they're using it. And they might not use it in the way that you would hope they do. So how can you think about channeling those energies? Language teachers, why are some, this one might seem obvious, but why are some words gendered? Why are there gendered pronouns in some languages, right? And which nouns get which gender attached to them? And why does this seem to be normal, right? How do the words we speak reinforce gender norms? So this is related to very important concepts, right? Dominant narratives. If I'm a historian, I love to think about not only what happened in the past, but how do we tell the story of what happened in the past? English teachers, there's a lot of room for you here, right? Like thinking about narrative and what tropes show up across societies, across genres, across works of literature. How do narratives get sustained, and why do they always have a root in history? Oh, this is what we do in America because it's the way it's always been. Capitalism is the system that works because people are just naturally competitive. Well, are they? Do you have a controlled double-blind model of what human nature is? No, probably not. So we're relying on these appeals to history. In the same way, right? Race is a social construct. Gender is performance. How did the idea of race get built across societies? Why does it matter? How did the idea of gender, different gender, showing up as male or female in different ways, how did those scripts get written? Of course, the idea of heteronormativity has the idea of normality baked into it, the idea that it's normal to be heterosexual. Normal is actually a word that's been used synonymously with heterosexual over the years. And that's wild. Because it's not about typicality. It's actually an argument to make people think that something's normal. So how do all these things get built and rebuilt and constantly reinforced, right? Race, gender, heterosexuality, these things are not, they don't correspond to anything in nature, and they're not things that are constant across history. They're things that exist in our moment at our time and have to get built and rebuilt over and over and over again. And that happens by exploring concepts like the idea of normal. So today, I'm going to go through an exercise with you that might serve to cultivate a healthy distrust of the idea of normal, but can also be constructive. It's going to serve potentially, I would use this as a unit opener too. So you can, and you definitely should tailor this to your subject and to your school community. But across subjects and school communities, I'm going to say that the goal here is going to be to have students get confused and to experience a little bit of cognitive dissonance as they realize that ideas that they take for granted just don't really correspond to reality. So confusion. I think a lot of teachers are already on board with this idea, but in case you're not, why confusion? Why do you want your students to be confused? So as smarter people than I have noted that there are times when students start to question the things around them, and these are good things for learning because then they feel like they have to make sense of things again. And this is the place where learning happens, right? So This little diagram I like is from Rhett Allen, and it shows the swamp of confusion towards building understanding, which is, just a kind of fanciful way of saying they kind of need to get lost in that space before they can start putting ideas back together. One thing that we as teachers have the ability to do that I think is really powerful is to help students see familiar things as unfamiliar, right? To again, to question what they see as normal in their society, their school, their own lives. But how they go about picking up those pieces, discovering where ideas of normal come from, that is going to be particular to your unit. And to do that, I like to start with the word. So breaking down words can be a very, very useful tool that give us a really nice place to take something that seems very, very simple and begin to show the layers that go into it. So simply by asking, what does normal mean? You're going to get a lot of answers that you can start to play around with. So I want you to go through this exercise too. And I'm not going to ask you to pause the video because, well, if I were watching, I wouldn't pause the video. So I am going to give you 3 minutes here, and I want you to just say, what does normal mean? How do you know? And you can't see me, but I can promise you that I'm going to be writing at the same time, okay? I'm writing at the same time as you, and this is a really important thing to do. Remember that as you start writing, okay, if you start to think, I don't know what to say, God, I'm getting lost in my thoughts, it's okay. That happens to us. The point here is that writing is thinking. And so if your students don't have anything to think about, if you don't have anything to think about, just write ABC, 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 until something else comes out. I'm going to give you 3 minutes for that, starting now. It's excruciating, right? Keep writing. Just about another minute left. Just finish whatever thought you're on. And then we're going to start taking things up. Again, okay, so you've written about what's normal. Now we're going to take it up. So there are all kind of ways that you can do this. I've successfully used Google Jamboards in the past. If you're in the classroom, you know, which maybe one day you'll be again, or maybe you are now, I have been, you may be able to use a whiteboard, right? Right now, I'm using something that I have used at home and in the classroom because I'm lucky enough to have an iPad here. I've called into my Zoom call with my iPad and I have this Zoom whiteboard, right? But there are different ways to do this. If you're at home using Zoom, you can use the whiteboard feature with text. If you're using a different platform, Jamboard, a shared Google Doc, a shared other type of document. There's lots of different ways. But here I've got the iPad, so this I'm gonna try writing it out a little. So you might want to start by just calling out, you know, you could put people in a parent share, but you can also just start by calling out, okay, what are some of the definitions of normal? And here are the things that I think you're going to get based on my experience doing this before, right? So people might say, okay, what does normal mean? Right? And they might say some of the things that we've talked about before, right? So things that are common, right? They might say things that lots of people do. You might get an answer about the inverse, right? So something that's not weird. As you get answers like this, I encourage you to, at first, just take them, okay? You're gonna have a lot of questions going through your head. You're gonna wanna push the kids, but if they're not saying anything that is hurtful or offensive, just take the answers, let them populate this, right? So common things lots of people do, not weird, and you might get surprising answers. Two, you probably want to get them to stay away from listing specific things that they think are normal or are not normal. But in general, right, how does the category get defined? So take the answers at first. As you take them, start thinking about pushing back. Okay, so if normal is what's common, for example, and or if they're saying that weird is its opposite, maybe start pushing back. So if I make another whiteboard here, right, I can start thinking about things, about questions, about ways that I would push on this, right? So not weird, so not common. So I don't know. Are rich people weird, right? Are extremely beautiful people weird? These are things that are not common, but are they things that tend to be called weird, right? Did anybody call anybody the weird sisters because they were really good looking? Probably not, right? How do we know is the next question, right? So you ask them not to just define normal, you ask them to explain, how do we know? So here again, I would take their answers and they hopefully they're gonna start coming to things on their own. And there's gonna be a variety of things that they say. They might start saying things like school, right? Media, depends what age your kids are, but kids are pretty, kids reach a point pretty quickly where they know that they're sort of expected to say the media as an answer a lot of the time. You might want to think about having them say, if they say something like society, right? Can you start to push back on what they mean by these different things? But how do we know what is typical? They're probably going to start to get confused. They're probably going to start to get a little uncomfortable, and this is good, right? It's important to start that momentum, to keep it going, and to keep the energy going. So how now maybe we move more towards this question of how the word gets used. And again, going back to this, do people use it? How have people used the word for you, right? So how have you heard this word? And again, get them to think about, like, does it discourage? or encourage. If somebody's talking to you and they say, that's really weird, or that's really, people maybe not say that's so normal, but if people say that it's not normal, is that somebody telling you to do something or to stop doing something? I would guess that in most cases, it is somebody telling you to not do it. And obviously there are going to be exceptions, right? There are things like normcore. There are people who want to be weird, who will say, oh, well, I don't want to be normal. That's so boring, right? Or the kind of nasty version of normal, which would be basic. But these are not really the same as normal in the way that we're talking about it here. These are sort of people being contrarian or trying to buck something. But for a lot of people, how does the word get normal used? And if somebody says something that's not normal, which is different than saying it's not basic, is that not normal? What are they saying? So now we might be getting to a point where students are completely confused, right? And this is good. They're in this zone. But sometimes when people get in this zone, they start to want to blow everything up. So ask them straight up, right? I think I find often with kids, it's useful to take them to logical conclusions and then bring them back. So we say, okay, should we throw out the word normal, right? Is it so meaningless or is it so pernicious that it's not useful at all? Can we think of examples where we use the word normal in a way that is not necessarily inflicting judgment? And everyone's going to think differently about this, right? So if we talk about a normal temp, right? We're all talking about this right now. Is it important to know that there are temperatures that signify sickness and some temperatures that signify healthiness, right? Is it valuable to talk about a normal temperature? They might not agree on this, but is it useful? And then there are areas where normal is so clearly judgment, right? If we're talking about clothes or appearance, if we're talking about sexuality, or behavior in general, right? If we're talking about behavior that doesn't hurt people, is there an issue there? And you want to bring them back and think about, okay, so when is normal used in a way that we think is analytical, helpful? When is normal used in a way that is just about saying what is good, what is common, what's old, what's natural, which is what people think it is, right? And you want to get at that idea too, that we think, oh, it's normal for men to like the color blue. What? We think it's normal for XYZ, right? Like I don't want to list these things too much, but because they're often so pernicious, but so many of them are based on ideas about what's old, what's common, what's natural. And those ideas are so often wrong. And I'm going to show you some examples of that later. But often they're using the word to mean good, and you want to get at that, right? When is the word used just to mean good, and how do we start to break that down? And does using the word in that way make any sense? And why is there something more insidious about using the word normal to mean good than about using the word good to mean good? So once we take these up, right, and you can do this in pair shares, you can do this in a large class discussion, then we can start thinking about a few more things. So you and your students have thought through how to break down. You've thought about where the word normal might come from. You've thought about how people internalize its meaning growing up in this society. And that's great. It can also help to start to break down the word itself for your students, right? So just take them back to the etymology. And this is another nice way of showing how something that we think means something has meant something else at a different time. It can mean something else again, and to watch things pick up meaning as time rolls on. So 16th century, good meant typical. Maybe that word was pretty strongly linked to the Latin norm, which meant a carpenter square. So the word has, for a long time, actually, and you see this really in the 17th century, used to mean right-angled, perpendicular, and this comes from this carpenter square, right? That little ruler thing pictured next to the text here. By the 19th century, it starts to be used to mean a normal school, right? So this is a school that trains teachers. And then in the 20th century, it comes to mean heterosexual. What? I mean, this is bizarre, right? So have students think about that bizarreness, embrace that bizarreness. How do we go from something that describes an angle? How do we go from something that describes adherence to a particular rule that might be useful in geometry or in carpentry to something that is describing sexuality and prescribing behavior? This is odd. This is the oddness of history. And have your students embrace that kind of torturous path that words can take. As you do that, I want you to zoom in and think about how social constructs are built. So this could be, I think at this point, a lot of students know the word social construct or social construction. It's okay if they don't. It can feel kind of jargony. If they bring it up, or if you want to bring it up, I think that's great. It can be useful, but I think it needs to be broken down for kids. They need to start to think about, okay, what's the social, what's the construct, how does society build something, who is society? Now that we've dismantled some of the power the word has, we have to think about how it actually gets built up, right? So this could be another good time for a free write, another good time for a turn and talk, small group work, if you're just trying to add some variety to the kind of large group discussions we're having. Ask them to think about this question, right? How did you come to think that something was normal or weird? Now, you know your class best. So you are nervous about them saying hurtful things here. You might want to think about having them make their writing private. But whether it's shared or not, have them think about this question. Have them think about how they personally have been implicated in constructing an idea of what is and is not normal. When you reconvene them, ask for some examples. Or, again, you know your class best, right? So you might skip right to asking, so who decides what's normal for, say, boys and girls to do? And you might get answers like society, like people. Okay, that's fine. Keep breaking those terms down. So which people? Is it the classmate to your left? Is it the classmate to your right? Is it your parents? Does society all agree on one thing? Did they take a poll? Did they read letters to the editor of the New York Times? Did you ask? Did anybody ask you what's normal for boys and girls to do? Right? Like, make it personal, make it concrete for them. It's so easy to say society did this, society did that. What does that mean? Who is society? And do some people have more power within society to decide what is normal or to communicate what is normal? It can be crucial here to think about different scales of analysis, right? There are different levers that act on all of us and different ways that all of us have power to respond to those levers. And it can be very useful to start working from the top, from the largest scale to the smallest scale. So how does society tell you what's normal, right? And we talk about that's a vague term. You're going to want to push on that. But broadly, how are you told what's normal in the same way that somebody 100 miles away is told what's normal, right? What are the ways of being normal that is communicated across different zip codes and cultures? How does our school tell you what's normal? How does our school tell you what's normal? And how do your family and friends tell you what's normal? They might be thinking about lots of things. They might give you lots of great answers, but here are some things you might want them to think about, right? Movies, TV, music, traditions and holidays. Is it normal to have a Christmas tree? Maybe, right? But is it normal for certain people to do the cooking on Christmas? Is it normal to celebrate Christmas? These are historically specific things, right? And we're not trying to make anybody feel uncomfortable with their family's traditions, unless they're harmful. But we want to denaturalize them. We want to make them think that, oh, this is something that was invented by somebody at some point and we do it for specific reasons because we are these people in this moment, rather than just having them think that something's existed forever. Codes of conduct, dress codes, right? This is kind of a big one for the schools. Curriculum. What subjects does the school tell you is normal to know about? What subjects does the school tell you is important to know about? And within those subjects, whose stories do you hear? Kids love examining their own curriculum. They love the idea that they should have a say in their own learning. And a lot of the time they really should. Thinking about that, push them to think about that. And this curriculum might not be in your control, right? This could be your school, but it could be society. Because are you teaching to a standardized tests? Are you teaching to state standards? Who decides? How does the school or society tell you what's normal? And then just thinking about what people they know praise or discourage. I have had students get quite open in this stage. We were breaking down gender with a group and having a student talk to me about the time that she moved into a new house and wanted to keep the blue and green wallpaper on the wall and had a family member insist that it be painted over pink. Things we don't think about, things we don't see as the obvious places where gender norms come from, and how are we implicated in fostering them. Next, you're going to want to think about tying this to hierarchies, right? So this part will probably be a little more lecture-based because they just don't necessarily know the answer here. You can certainly solicit opinions. But we want to think about gender norms, right? And how things can go from just being this, okay, so we're setting out what's normal, but who cares? Why does it matter? It matters because, in part, because we're creating hierarchies here. So when we talk about what's normal for boys or girls or men and women, or the fact that there's the idea even of being a gender binary, this stuff is, as they've hopefully guessed, it's all made up. And in different times and places, it has differed. Pink has been seen as a boy's color. Women have been the main financial protectors of their family. Same-sex partners have not been seen as an unusual thing to have. Gender has existed in many different ways. And all of this stuff was invented. And as it's invented, first of all, it's not natural, common, or old, right? But as it's invented, it creates hierarchies in societies that exert power on certain people. Let me give you an example of why this stuff matters, of how you can use history to look at it. I don't know about you, I have had a lot of students talk to me about things that they thought were traditional. And I always ask them, what does this word mean? What does traditional mean? Traditional is so closely linked to normal, to natural, to common, and it's a talking point, right? This is a political talking point. It comes from decades of trying to convince people that certain forms of family relationships, certain behaviors are quote unquote traditional. And traditional is a great thing to hide behind, right? You're not saying, I think this is good. You're saying, well, this is traditional. And I think tradition is good. And who could argue with that? Right? Tradition is a bipartisan issue in America. But tradition is not always what it seems to be. Right? Things that we call tradition are often quite new. This is the power of history. So here is Congressman Steve King's webpage, an excerpt from it. Traditional and family values. He supports traditional and family values. What are those? In part, he and many of the people who use this throughout the 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, when you get into culture wars in the 90s, would talk about traditional family values about marriage rates, for example. That people were no longer getting married. That people were getting married later. That the family was falling apart. Okay, so let's take a look at this. When exactly was the family traditional? Was it at the turn of the century when just over 50% of women got married? Or was it in the 1950s at this high watermark. And who are we talking about here? If you look at different racial and ethnic groups here, the marriage rates have differed at different times. And then there are charts like this that I always like to show. Here's our median age at first marriage. 1890, 22 for women, right? When did we get back to that? Not until 1980 did we get back to the marriage age being as high as it was in 1890, almost 100 years for women. Obviously, it has risen significantly since then, although whether 28 to 22 is a significant rise is another question you could ask your class. But regardless, what is the traditional American family here? Because for most of American history, it's not at this low point that is commonly used as a reference, which is the 50s, right? We all know about the idea of the 50s nuclear family, the prototypical white family, husband, wife, and 2 children. But that was a brief moment in time. So what's normal? Is normal that 1950s family, or is that 1950s family weird? Is that the aberration? Right? Marriage rates for women have only been heavily over 50% in this brief period. Lots of women have not been married for much of American history. And this is also a good reminder to students that history does not guarantee progress, right? And obviously not everybody looks at choice and marriage as progress, but for those who do, the question of whether history just means things get more open and more fluid, which is also a talking point among people who talk about traditional values, right? That things used to be more conservative, that if I support something more conservative, I'm actually just heralding back to the status quo of yesteryear, is not true. Right? If you look at history, that's actually part of the construction of normal. It's not something that is based in history. Actually, sexuality became less fluid over time. Actually, gender roles have become more constrained over time. Women have had more constraints in some ways put on them over time. Right? Women in New Jersey could vote until 1807. The vote was taken from them. Things do not just get better and better. And when we're talking about gender roles, they don't just become looser over time, even though a lot of people think that. Things may become freer over time in some places, but they can contract again. And it's really linked to what people believe and what people say is normal at any given time. And so a lot of this relates to why this matters. And these are some of the questions that you can leave your class with, right? Like, how does the power to cast some people as abnormal allow others to shape society? How does the power to impose shame or conformity sustain hierarchies? And hopefully it's not just here a story of decline for students or a sad story. I think this is also a really hopeful message. The thing about history is that history teaches us that anything that was different can be different again. But for any subject, right? By learning that how much of society is created by people, well, we're people. So we can change it. If things aren't just the way they are because they're the way they are, well, no one can fight the way things are, right? Whoever that is, God or nature. But if things aren't just old, common, or typical, if they're actually created and imposed and people have to be persuaded to think certain things are normal, people can be persuaded differently. People changed once, so they'll change again. Your students have agency here. And so this is important. And because it's about cultivating your students' agency, this is a foundation for future work. So if this was me, I might then take this as a prompt for students to keep in mind as they're going through the next unit. And, everybody has different levels of freedom, but I might have my students look for, say, how have different moments in US history, let's say I'm teaching US history, led to different definitions of normal for men and women. And I want them to think about this as creatively as possible. So if I'm looking at the Gilded Age, fashion and consumerism changed in the Gilded Age, industry changed in the Gilded Age, technology changed in the Gilded Age, and how did some of these become seen as more or less appropriate for women or men? How did they even begin to create and solidify those boundaries of what it meant to be women and men, right? Did something change once most men started leaving the home to work? Because they used to work at home, and were women really seen as not working in the same way then? There's a lot of fruitful avenues for investigation here, no matter what your students are interested in. And it's incredibly intersectional. It ties to the formation of racial categories. It ties to the formation of class categories. It ties to behavior. It cuts across ethnic boundaries and location. So could it prompt a unit project? How would you use it? Hopefully, this provides you a lot of fruit for your teaching. Thank you so much for coming. Thank you so much for watching this. I hope it's helpful. Again, my name is Michael Kadekel. If you have any questions, please get in touch with Teach About Women. I would be happy to chat and check out our interactive webinars. I hope this helps. You're going to do great work. Good luck.